I'm Susan Euler.
Let's begin by asking a basic question. Sculpture or statue? Is there a difference? Well, yes and no, not really. All statues are sculptures, but not all sculptures are statues. These are statues. These are sculptures. You see what I did here? I put Michelangelo's David in both categories. Not to confuse you, but to prove a point. The difference between what is a statue and what is a sculpture is blurry and not easy to define. As it's generally understood, a statue depicts a thing, for want of a better term. A person, typically an important person such as Augustus Caesar, a deity, an animal, or an abstract idea. For example, liberty. And just to be clear, a statue does not have to be realistic. So, to understand modern sculpture and its origins, a place to start is by thinking of all three-dimensional works of art as sculpture, not as statues. Ancient Greek discus thrower, sculpture. Claes Oldenburg's soft toilet, sculpture. Marcel Duchamp's bicycle wheel, sculpture. It doesn't matter the material, the subject matter, the style, the size, the culture of origin, or the time period. If it's a three-dimensional work of art, it's a sculpture. Unlike painting, which changed a great deal stylistically over the centuries, sculpture remained remarkably the same. In fact, if I ask you to identify which sculpture was from ancient Rome, which was from the 17th century Baroque period, and which was from the 19th century, it would be pretty difficult to tell because they look very similar. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the traditional purposes for sculpture. Early in human history, people realized that a realistic, freestanding statue was an ideal way to communicate societal and religious concepts. This is your queen. Respect her. Here are your laws. Obey them. Thus, artists have traditionally created statues depicting things from the real world, which their intended audience would recognize immediately and associate with the ideas represented. For example, the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty represents the abstract concept of liberty, specifically American liberty, although it depicts a woman dressed like an ancient Roman. This woman is Libertas, the Roman goddess of liberty. In order to fully understand the meaning of the statue, you must know the meaning of the thing depicted, in this case, the goddess Libertas, and what that thing symbolizes. That is, liberty. Here's where things get tricky. Once the cultural associations are lost, the statue loses its intended meaning and its symbols and underlying concepts can no longer be understood. So art historians like myself have to step in and explain them to you. However, no art historian in the world can fully understand and explain the exact cultural meaning of, say, the Venus of Willendorf. It's probably a fertility object, or not. No one knows for certain, too far back in time. But returning to the Statue of Liberty, in 1886, when the statue was dedicated, Libertas, or Lady Liberty, was well known to the American public. It was a common reference seen everywhere. So the meaning of the Statue of Liberty, with all its nuances, would have been widely understood without further explanation. Today, not so much. And sometime in the future, not at all. Which brings up an important point. We are so conditioned to the idea that sculptures must convey meaning that when we see one we don't immediately understand, we wonder, what's this supposed to be? But do you wonder the same thing about Michelangelo's David? Probably not, because it's realistic, and most of us know the person it represents, David from the biblical story of David and Goliath. David was a young man armed only with a slingshot, who bravely faced and killed the giant Philistine warrior Goliath. But what you may not know is that this sculpture is also a Statue of Liberty. During the Renaissance, the small, relatively weak Italian city-state of Florence, Michelangelo's hometown, saw itself as a citadel of democracy, forced to defend itself against hostile takeovers from all sides. The Florentines characterized themselves as David, and their enemies as Goliath, who they hoped to defeat by courage and perseverance alone, since they lacked a strong standing army. But do you need to know all that in order to appreciate the David as a work of art? Of course not. You can admire it for its beauty, its superb craftsmanship, its overall design, and much, much more. Like music, a work of sculpture speaks for itself. And that's the key to understanding modern sculpture. A sculpture doesn't have to be a statue created to convey a specific social, religious, or historical message, and it doesn't have to represent anything from the real world. It can, of course, and often does, but that's no longer essential. Like modern painting, modern sculpture can be pure design. This is a new concept. In fact, we can trace it back to the year 1877 exactly. That was the year in which the French sculptor Auguste Rodin exhibited the Age of Bronze. Just to be clear, Auguste Rodin is not the same Rodin as the flying prehistoric reptile from the old Japanese monster movies. Auguste Rodin is the artist who created the thinker. Rodin was a statue maker in the truest sense of the word. He made statues. Specifically bronze statues, which he first modeled in clay, made into a mold, then cast, first in plaster, then in bronze. And since his sculptures are cast, not carved, many casts were made using the same mold. And all are authentic Rodins as long as he authorized their production. For example, there are 27 known full-size castings of the thinker, although not all were made during Rodin's lifetime. But returning to the Age of Bronze, which was the first work he ever exhibited, the reason this work is considered revolutionary may not be immediately obvious. But look closely. Although it's a standing male nude, done in the ancient Greek realist tradition, Rodin does not give the subject the usual identifying characteristics. No spear, no sword, no discus. Compare the Age of Bronze with another 19th century sculpture, Perseus with the head of Medusa, by Antonio Canova. Perseus has a sword, a cloak, a helmet, and of course the severed head of Medusa, so there is no question as to who and what this sculpture represents. But Rodin's work, with the empty clenched fist and anguished facial expression, depicts not a specific person or event, but a feeling, a sense of defeat and pain, hence its alternate title, The Vanquished. This represents an entirely new way of thinking about sculpture. But how is this different from the Statue of Liberty? It represents an abstract concept too. Yes, it does. But like all these other national symbols, the Statue of Liberty conveys an agreed-upon cultural meaning that people can immediately recognize and understand. Not so with The Vanquished. Each viewer can interpret it based on their own perceptions and life experiences. In 1878, Rodin created St. John the Baptist preaching, but we only know it depicts the biblical figure because of its title. Rodin described it as a sculpture about movement. He has caught St. John in mid-stride, with both feet planted firmly on the ground. As Rodin explained, I have always endeavored to express the inner feelings by the mobility of the muscles. The study for the work, which he also cast in bronze, is headless and armless. Called the walking man, it is even more of a depiction of movement because it focuses on the legs, which are, of course, the main body parts needed for walking. No sculptor before Rodin had made a work depicting something as basic and ordinary as the act of walking. It was revolutionary. The walking man is known as a partial figure. After Rodin introduced the concept, other artists followed his lead. Rodin inspired other changes as well. Artists began asking themselves, why should sculpture be made only of bronze or marble? Why not make sculpture out of cardboard, wire, found objects, cloth, industrial materials such as steel, vinyl, rubber, and plexiglass? No reason whatsoever. Thus, at the beginning of the 20th century, sculpture entered a new era of innovation. Although traditional bronze and marble statues are still being made, artists also make constructions, sculptures put together or constructed out of various disparate materials, and ready-mades, which take objects from the real world and repurpose them as sculpture. And there are also earthworks, mobiles, and light sculptures, as well as temporary installations, such as Christo's running fence. Although we commonly think of modern sculpture as being abstract or non-representational, when we visit a museum or sculpture garden, we see that much of it depicts objects from the real world as well. There are really no rules or one dominant style, and new, interesting concepts and materials are being introduced all the time, such as recycled plastic bottles. We may need a new name for this because if we continue to expect all modern sculptures to be realistic and convey cultural, social, and religious meaning, we are bound to remain confused. But remember, it was only 150 years ago that Rodin set all this in motion. A very, very short time when you consider that realistic, storytelling, meaning-laden statues have existed for thousands and thousands of years. So don't worry about it. Just enjoy the experience these sculptures have to offer. Modern sculpture in all its different forms is pretty interesting in and of itself. Do works of art have to be more than that? I don't think so.
For the 10-Minute Professor, this is Dr. Susan Ray Euler. Thanks for tuning in.